Hello and welcome to Office of Harbour. It is now the 5th year that I've been running this channel, and it's finally time that I think I've read enough that I can make recommendations videos, and that's something that I've been wanting to do for a while, but with the amount I've been reading, and I've always been someone that felt like I was playing catch-up with my reading. I went through many years where I didn't read anything or only read one or two books, and so compared to people that have had really rich reading diets their entire life, I'm really just working off these last couple of years where I've been tracking. So it's hard for me to talk about books that I really enjoy because the majority of things I read I think are okay or have their high points, but I don't really rave about them. I don't really feel like they've magically changed me in some way. And so this video, I actually want to talk about reading goals. I recently put out a video reflecting on the 100 books that I read last year, and having been a different pace of reader for all the different phases of my life, I want to think about what people's reading goals are. I've talked to people recently that want to read 20 books this year or 50 books this year, and I want to talk about what each amount of book says about a person and make some recommendations for how many books a particular person wants to read in a particular year. First of all, I want to start with 0 books a year. So I think that this is the majority of my friends, and that's totally fine. There is nothing wrong with not reading anything, and there are plenty of years of my life where I didn't read anything at all. Most egregiously, the years where I was an English teacher, I read nothing, and that's the reality of the job, is that sometimes you just don't have time to read. Reading does take concentration, it takes stepping away from a really busy lifestyle, and while that can be a really good thing, you also get a lot done if you don't have to worry about however many books you need to get through in a year. So don't let anyone talk down to you if you don't read that much. That's totally fine, and make sure that you are making the most of the time that you are doing. That's not what this video is about though, so we're going to start with the 1 book challenge. This is something that a friend told me about, and I find it so interesting and so fascinating. They set their reading goal to a single book because their intention is just to have read 1 book at all at any point of the year. This is really useful if you're someone that doesn't read and wants to start reading. Rather than starting a really lofty goal of 20 books or 50 books, just 1 book can be very motivating. And it doesn't mean that you can only read 1 book, it just means that as long as you've read your 1 book, then you succeed, and then you can move in whatever direction you like. So my recommendations for the people out there whose goal is to read 1 book this year, I would suggest a well-known but approachable classic. And so here are the 5 that I would suggest. Yeah, there we go. Why was that so clumsy? The Hobbit. So everyone knows The Hobbit. This is very readable and genuinely a very good time. So The Lord of the Rings, oh gosh. Let's not talk about The Lord of the Rings. But The Hobbit is very short and very accessible. Some may call it children's fiction, but it's enjoyable for anyone of any age. It is about Bilbo Baggins, who is just this regular chill dude, likes his tea and likes resting, and one day a wizard named Gandalf comes to his house and says he's got to go on this big quest. It's well-paced and it's not too challenging and just a lot of fun the whole way through. The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway is a very, very short book. It takes about as much time to watch a movie, maybe a bit less. It is about a fisherman off the coast of Cuba and reflects a moment of Hemingway's life as well, where he was in a big slump with his writing. And so he's writing about this fisherman who previously was this heroic figure and is now down on his luck, and the young boy who likes to go on these fishing trips with him in order to encourage him or see what the wide world out there is like. And so we have this old man who ends up in this battle with nature. He catches this enormous fish, and well, it's just the journey of this book that I find really uplifting in a way, is that the way that it's written, it's so clear and it's crisp and it's very powerful. By the end of it, it makes me feel like I want to go out and see the world and do a lot of things. So a very masculine book, some caveats, but I enjoy it for what it is. The Great Gatsby, one of the most read books of all time. So an American high school mainstay. I think that this is still very accessible. It's not very long, and though it is from the 1920s, so it does have its own language that's a bit different to what we might speak today, I think the characters are just very timeless. I love the way that they're very exaggerated, and we see everything through Nick, our narrator, who is in some ways the most normal of the bunch, but he's also a very judgmental person. He's very good at looking through people and seeing what their core motivations are. And when we then pay our attention to this 1920s era New York, when people are getting very rich very fast and having these big lavish parties and living in a way that's guided by those strong emotions, it just makes for a very entrancing read. Even though that this book is very critical of the American dream and critical of the opulence of this time, it's just a very alluring book to me. I think the descriptions of the scenes and the larger-than-life characters is very, very enjoyable. To Kill a Mockingbird, a contentious classic, but definitely worth reading. I have had a very fun experience where I've been talking to someone who recently read this book, and they were hooked the whole way through. If you don't know the plot of this book, or if you know just some strains of the plot of the book, I think it still works very well. The pacing is just really well done. It's got elements of mystery and coming of age and small town life. It knows when to be fast and it knows when to be slow. And yes, there are lots of discussions to be had about its representation of race and about its representations of justice in, I guess, the civil rights movement era America, but I think that conversation is still a worthwhile one to be had. I wouldn't necessarily say that this book is entirely correct about its representation of certain people groups or certain attitudes towards justice, but its heart is in the right place, and it's something that I think speaks a lot to how we view other people today and the strides that we've made in terms of overcoming prejudices, which I guess is the core theme of this book as well. But the way this book comes together, though, is through its narrator and through its themes. All of that, I think, works very well, and it pulls the reader along in a way that is really welcoming. I really like Harper Lee's style. I really like these characters that she's created, and it's a really important book. And a small challenge, but Pride and Prejudice, so I find this to be a very calming read. There's not a lot of high-stakes things going on here, but we do have lots of conversations, lots of garden parties. We have characters that are easily understood. They communicate themselves and their values really well. And although that we're dealing with a different time period, a different context, and I'm not the biggest fan of Regency England, I'm really not. I don't relate to the kinds of characters and conflicts that exist there. But I think Pride and Prejudice I make an exception for. I think we have characters that are quite easy to like and quite easy to root for. We feel like we're invited along to these parties as well, and we feel like we're making decisions with these characters too. So it's such a book that is known and worth talking about, that being able to have these reference points, being able to talk about Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, and being able to know who they are and who they represent, I think is still very worthwhile. So as someone reads this, I can imagine them gaining additional insight into how relationships work both in the past and today, and how a book like this and the characters like this can continue to inform the way that we see the world. I'm going to be honest, talking about these books I feel really silly. Recommending these books that everybody knows about, well, what's the point? I hope that for the people who are not very habitual readers, that one of these is accessible. And one of my favorite things about reading, more so than the books themselves, is reading something and talking to somebody afterwards. And so there is a very, very high chance that the person in your life that reads often has read most, if not all, of these. And so once you finish one, you can absolutely go to them and speak to them about it. None of these books are perfect, and they all have their own contentious moments. But because they're classics, because they have this cultural weight, then people will have opinions about them. And having that discussion is also one of the most worthwhile parts of reading. If you're reading 5 books a year, then I think reading is a kind of special activity. So I used to read 5 books a year around the time when I was not at university, but when I graduated in the first few years I was working, when I wasn't a teacher yet. I would sometimes have days where I think, oh, I have nothing to do this weekend, or I have nothing to do this afternoon. And so I might just pull out a book. I would buy a lot of books, but I wouldn't really read them. And I would pull out a book and I would just start reading it. And there were particular moments in my life that were very conducive to reading, often waiting around at airports or times where I knew that I would have nothing to do except read. Then this to me was a kind of special thing. So you don't need to have a routine or a habit, but sometimes if you would like to read more, and you can think of some times in a year where you would like to sit down the same way that you might sit down to watch a movie or watch a sporting game or go to a concert, you can grab a book, and these are the ones that I would recommend. I'm not going to toss them every single time I feel like I've just spilled them all over my desk, but I would recommend for the folks that read 5 books a year, a well-paced, standalone genre, or yeah, kind of like a genre novel. I feel like all 5 of these to me represent some kind of genre, except they're not those enormous doorstopper series that take a lot of effort to read. They are something that are self-enclosed and really enjoyable for what they are. My Year of Rest and Relaxation, this one goes out to all people who hate their jobs. This is a satirical novel about a young woman working for a publishing firm who decides to quit her job spectacularly and take a bunch of prescription medication in order to stay in bed for an entire year. It is about a very, very stark and drastic type of character, and it's written in the first person. She has this tremendously odd yet very engaging character voice. It's a very kinetic novel, it's very easy to follow. It does go to some weird and at times harrowing places, but it's a wonderful discussion piece. I have recommended this book, I think, more than any other book. I've given it to lots of people, and it's just a great way to talk about how we think about work today, and also just a bizarre, bananas fun time. The Haunting of Hill House remains one of my favorite horror novels of all time. This is a book that gaslights you. This is a book that makes you wonder what is happening and what isn't happening. It's about a house that's not actually kind of haunted by anything, it's just this really evil space. And it's about the characters that end up residing there for a couple of days, and the relationships they have with one another, and they have with themselves in the space of this supernatural thing. We have really, really dramatic and evocative scenes, and we have these archetypal emotions spilling out so powerfully. And amidst all of this as well, we have just very, very beautiful passages that I continue to remember. The opening lines as well, very famous. Just a great read, not too long, and a lot of stuff to ponder about after you finish as well. These next two, I've got 2 science fiction standalones to talk about. First of them is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. This is the book that was eventually adapted to Blade Runner, but I feel like the novel has its own merits as well. Similarly to The Haunting of Hill House, this is also a book that kind of gaslights you because it is about artificial humans, and so all the characters you come across, you wonder, oh, are they real or are they fake? Are they trying to deceive the character? And it results in this very fast-paced, paranoid novel where our protagonist, Rick Deckard, whose job is to find and terminate these synthetic humans, we start to wonder about what his motivations are and who all the people he comes across, whether they are going to be loyal, whether they are going to be dangerous. I think everything's just paced really well, and it's also different enough from the film that the experience is enjoyable and you don't feel spoiled once you get to certain points. So quite a well done book. And also The Star's My Destination. So this one's a bit harder to find, but it is a very, very well done standalone novel that's old and yet predicts our current future quite well. It does include teleportation in order to make it a kind of interplanetary adventure, but ultimately it's about large companies that exploit human beings, and this one figure who develops powers strong enough in order to possibly resist the power that this company has. Every chapter is so quickly paced, you're just traveling across this amazing adventure, and you get that element of political intrigue and economic discussion as well, whilst you're having this really great adventurous time. So if science fiction interests you at all, these 2 would be my pick. And lastly, a kind of fantasy book is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So the premise of this is a bit confusing, and it is at times hard to get into, but because it's so standalone, and because it doesn't really rely on you needing to know other works or other mythologies, like, it's beneficial if you do, but you can go into this book just completely in the dark and have a good time. It is about this infinite labyrinth where our narrator is trying to figure out where he is and what all the various rooms mean, and there is a very limited amount of information that he's given. And so because of this, the reader is taken along on this remarkable mystery where we're also trying to figure out, what is this space? How does this space work? And we have elements of survival as well. We're trying to map things out and figure out how we can survive in this place. It's just a very well designed and paced novel. It's very memorable, and it's not quite similar to anything else as well. It is a great talking point and a great gift to give. If you are someone that likes books for their cinematic qualities, I think Piranesi works very, very well. Our next category is a pretty big jump, I will admit. We're going to 20 books a year. And 20 books a year to me is a pretty solid reading challenge. I think folks that set themselves the goal of reading 20 books a year want to start some kind of regular reading practice, whether it is something like a book club or a period of reading every certain day of the week. But there is this developing sense of regularity. So what I find really challenging about reading 20 books a year, and this is the amount that I was reading when I was doing my teaching course, doing my coursework, and also just picking out things that I found interesting, is that there were certain books that would really send me into a slump. And sometimes these were books that were just a bit too challenging for me at that point, but also sometimes they were books that just weren't interesting to me. I find what's really nice about reading 20 books a year is that you do get to pick the books that you really want to read. You think about what's enjoyable to you, and you don't waste time on books that don't necessarily fit your view of what's interesting. And so I find the people that I know that read around 20 books a year, they do DNF quite often. They will borrow from libraries, they'll do first lines, they won't waste their time on things that don't interest them. And that's admirable, because as someone who nowadays is reading 100 books a year, I've read a lot of bad books. I've finished a lot of books that I feel like I've wasted my time having done so. And it's nice to not worry about that. So with the folks doing 20 books a year, my recommendation is to diversify out a bit. Read books from people that are from different backgrounds, from different time periods. Read books that experiment with language a little bit and do some weird things that you've never seen before. I think the biggest risk when reading 20 books a year is starting to think that everything's kind of the same. And although it's good to develop pace, to develop tastes, and to fall into a particular preferred genre, I think you grow tired of it eventually. No matter how good a genre is, if you're only reading the same thing over and over again, there's only so many new things you can do. And so diversifying really allows you to feel how much there is in this world of reading. And so the books that I've recommended are these 5, each of them representing a different style of fiction or a different background of fiction. I'll start with a recent one. Orbital by Samantha Harvey is set in space, and it's a book without really an overarching plot. It is a story of astronauts orbiting the world, and it's reflecting on how it feels to be a figure watching the whole of humanity on this planet, how our perspective as human beings can change so much, and being able to use fiction in order to put us in the state and make us reflect on who we are, not just individually but as a species, I think is really interesting. It showed me something that I'd not seen or thought about before, and I thought I was really grateful to read it. On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. So I personally love novels written by poets. And so Ocean Vuong started out as a poet, and a very successful one. On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous is a semi-autobiographical story of a young queer Asian man growing up, and stories of his relationships with his family and with his partners that at times when they become so charged with emotion that they turn into poetry. And so we really feel the depth of emotion for this character here. I think that there are certain scenes and certain conversations in this book. I read this maybe 5 years ago. I still remember them. They're just really compelling. And being able to communicate this through fiction is something that early on in my, I guess, not early on my reading journey, but during my reading journey, this book showed me a lot more of what fiction could do. And being able to combine different elements of different mediums to do that was really effective as well. Beloved by Toni Morrison is an unusual ghost story. So it is about the haunting of a house and the story of an African-American woman that killed her own daughter rather than let her be born to slavery, and the ramifications that exist for a character living in that kind of environment. So the premise is really brutal, but there is also just a tremendous amount of love here, and the way this book will jump back and forward in time mid-paragraph just completely trusts in the reader's ability to follow along with the fracture that occurs because of something as traumatic as slavery and as traumatic as losing someone's child. I think the experimentation with fiction and literary techniques is necessary in order to communicate just how emotional of an experience that is. And so this book remains very memorable to me. It's something that, like all the other ones in this category, I think show me different ways that fiction can function in order to show me different emotions. And as someone that doesn't really have a lot of connection to African American culture, or specifically to this period of history, I thought that I felt my emotions very strongly while reading this. And I really have the way this book experiments with literature to thank for that. Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih is a political book, and it's a way of using fiction in order to show us a hypothetical and to make an argument about how the world works and how geopolitics works that's very understandable to me. So this is about a Sudanese man who travels to the West for an education and then returns back to his home in order to, I guess, try and find a better way of life for his family. And it's difficult when Western attitudes of logic and of governance interact with the difficulties of a country like Sudan, because this is a country that's effectively impoverished by Western policies. And so can you use a Western education in order to rectify the damage that Western power structures caused? And what do you do in order to enact that? Like, do you use force, or do you use diplomacy? Do you use education? And how do you relate to people now that you've filled yourself with a set of values that alienates you from your family and your community? These are such difficult questions that I, before reading this, didn't have to ask. And yet in such a short book and in such a easily communicated prose style, I think that this novel really successfully made me think more deeply about these ideas. So very grateful to have read this, and this is something that I would not have read if I was not actively seeking out for things that showed me different elements of the world. I think I read it specifically for a challenge of trying to read a book from every country. I've put that on pause for now because the idea of countries is a bit difficult in a challenge like this, but still a great read and very glad to have found it. And lastly, probably the hardest novel in this set, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is a magical realist novel that's set in Colombia. It is about the Buendia family and the generations of their family who are named either Aureliano or Jose Arcadio, and their exploits and how their evolution and growth throughout the modernization of Colombia parallels the way the country changes, but also just how much both darkness and beauty exists within the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is a novel that chronicles certain historical events and shows the way that this family interacts with them, but it's also one that expresses how improbable life can be sometimes. That sometimes we encounter things that we would never expect. We experience emotions that we never would as well. And what language, what symbols, what way of communicating this do we have? Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes there are things that elude our ability to understand. And there are lots of scenes in the novel where I look back and I think, that was really beautiful. Like, I felt that very strongly. But what did it actually mean? And I think being able to sit with the fact that I don't know, that there is no one-to-one relationship between what happens and what that means ultimately, and yet still being able to communicate and still being able to feel human emotion through witnessing that, I think that's something that I really gained out of reading this. It is a tough text. I think the amount of characters is high, and the book almost doesn't feel like it wants to be understood. Sometimes it feels very complex, but gosh, it was a good reading experience as well. And it's due for a reread, I think. Now that I have read a bit more from this author and a bit more from that region, I'm interested in going back and seeing if I recognize some of these things a bit more. If your reading goal this year is to read 50 books, so 50 books is about a book a week, with 2 weeks off for breaks or whichever. This is a very regular reading habit, and it's something that develops over time. So the first year I read 50 books in a year was 2020. This was during COVID, and at the start of the year I'd had a lot of time just at home by myself, so I decided to start this reading habit. But towards the end of the year, and this is the most important part for me, and that's the thing that's stayed constant for the last couple of years doing these videos, is that I started a job that required me to be on the train for about 40 minutes to an hour every day, which meant that I was reading on the train for about 40 minutes to an hour every day. It was Good too that was on a very quiet train line, so contrasting to the cemetery now, on a very quiet train line, which meant that there wasn't anyone talking, no one kind of distracting me. I could just really focus and lock in, and every day I would be reading around 60 to 100 pages. I also found out that I'm a relatively fast reader, so most people's reading speeds averages around 250 words per minute. I've done some tests and I find out that I read at around 500, sometimes even 750 words a minute. The reason why I read so fast, and it's not something that like I'm bragging about or anything, it's just something that I developed because when I was a teacher, I would scan novels and scan short stories for relevance for teaching, which meant that I could very quickly pass through the information and figure out, oh, this is a story that's useful for coming of age, or this is a story that's useful for the hero's journey. This is a story that I can't use because it has this objectionable content. And so I'm not so much enjoying the work as I am trying to categorize it. It does mean that I can finish a lot more books faster, and that first year that I read 50 books a year, I surprised myself with just how easy it was to do that. But it also means that I don't savor things as much. And I think when you're hitting 50 books a year, you're going to start churning. You're going to start reading books that you're not going to remember by the end of the year. And it could be nice to start a practice of journaling or reviewing or making videos like this in order to remember everything. I mean, that's why I started this channel at all, is that the first year I read 50 books, I thought, I don't remember every single one of these. And so the next year when I planned to read even more, I wanted to remember everything that I read. And so I wanted to have all my thoughts down in this place. My recommendation, though, is that if you are setting out to read 50 books a year, to shock the system sometimes, because again, the easiest way to get into a slump is to read a book that is dissatisfying, or read a book that is hard to slog through because it's not well written, or it's too similar to something you previously read, or it's not interesting to you. If your goal is to finish a large amount of books, like 50 books, then DNFing is not an efficient use of time. You should probably try and finish the books that you start, even if it means making it through some things that do feel like a waste of time. And so having a few books to look forward to that are different, that are unusual, that show different elements of what literature can do and make you look forward to future reads, that's what I would suggest. And so these are all books, whoops, I'm missing one. These are all books that do something interesting with fiction and showed me a new lens of the world, not just through what's being told, but how that story is being told. I've got to mention too that sometimes when you read 50 books a year and you've done that for a few years, you start to recognize names, you start to recognize patterns, you start to be able to categorize books into genres a lot better, just to recognize what prizes mean, what movements mean. You'll know what modernism is, you'll know what romanticism is, you'll know how books start to connect to one another, and you'll feel like you're the target market for modern contemporary books now as well, because I find the challenging thing with modern contemporary books is that they assume the reader likes reading, which is not always true. Sometimes I find a book in a bestseller list or whatever, and it's referencing Mark Twain, and it's referencing like Herman Melville or whatever. I just think like someone buying a book as a gift for a friend, they're not going to know how much reading background they have, and it sometimes feels very kind of disrespectful when an author just keeps name dropping all the various things that they've read in order to sound smart or in order to appeal to a wide reading audience. And so once you start reading 50 plus books a year, you will start to get these references and you will start to feel kind of in the club, and that can be a good feeling as well. That is what I want to talk about with this first book, Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi. This is a novel that's about a person who ends up constructing a golem, or like a creature of flesh, using body parts found through terror attacks across the city. And so it is a very, very political book, but it is also deeply satirical. It finds a lot of horror and humor in the kind of situation that they have. And while it is very searing in its indictment of political policies, and especially global politics that have led to the situation, it also looks in a very, very interesting way at literature and at personhood. And being a novel that is so inspired by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I think having read Frankenstein before reading this, I did enjoy it a lot more. I could see the references being made, and I could see that this book was functioning as an argument for the role of literature and the role of political literature in a response to something like Frankenstein, which to me now reads as something of a, I guess, more just like a literary reflection on humanity, of universality, of reading a classic book for its statement on what it means to be a human versus reading a modern contemporary book on what it means to exist in a certain time and place, to be a certain class or demographic of person, and how to express yourself in that sense. A wonderfully difficult and multifaceted book, and really, really worth talking about, which is sort of a shame because I don't know anyone else who's read this, but it's really good. A Visit to the Goon Squad is a novel that I have a very soft spot for because it's about one of my favorite themes. It's about people in their 20s and people in their 40s and jumping back and forth and seeing how did you become what you became. It is a novel that is told in different short sections, and each section uses a different style of narration, and by switching up all these styles, it feels like a very buoyant reading experience. Some sections are sci-fi, some sections are like newspaper articles, some sections are just straightforward narration, and there is a PowerPoint. I've talked about this PowerPoint a great deal. I really like the PowerPoint in this novel. And so being able to tell people that I recommend this book, and by the way, there's a PowerPoint in there, and it's a very emotional experience, it's just funny, right? I love this notion of books being able to surprise people constantly by pushing the boundaries of what a book can be, and this one is just a very great entry point into it by being both a bestseller and a Pulitzer Prize winner, but also just something that is weird, something that's unusual. This one I went looking for and I couldn't find it, so I wonder if I've lent it out, but The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro is a book that I think about very, very often. I read this in the first year that I read 50 books in 1 year, and it's the one that stays with me, because The Buried Giant is primarily about this moral dilemma, and I can't say what it is because I feel like I'll spoil it, but it has to do with memory. It has to do with the two older protagonists that go on a quest in Arthurian England, and at each step of the way, they're questioning the elements of their previous life. They have a son who's passed away, and they constantly have these discussions about whether the things happening around them are true or not, or are false or not. Can they trust the memories they currently have? And each little step of the way of their journey is a test of their relationship and a test of their understanding of this concept of memory. And so while it is this traditional quest narrative, it just asks this fascinating question. And it made me kind of stare at a wall by the end, because it made me reassess the relationships that I had with people around me. It made me reassess if the choices I'd made in my life were correct or not. And if a book can do that, if a book can actually make me think more deeply about my life, then that's really what I read for. So The Buried Giant, very highly recommended. Milkman by Anna Burns is an unusual novel. This is a novel set in, although it's not named, it's very heavily clued into the island, and it's about that kind of domestic political turmoil. I find that a lot of the books I talk about in this category are political. But living in a city where there's factions, and your loyalty to any particular faction can be determined by who you are, what you do, how you dress, your attitude towards certain things. And it uses this nameless city and nameless protagonist to show how this period of division allows some really terrible people to thrive. So the protagonist is being stalked by someone who everyone calls the Milkman, even though they're not really a milkman, that's just the name that everyone knows them by. And so we have this encroaching and looming feeling of dread, and the protagonist is working their way through the city and slowly revealing to us how unusual it is to be living in this circumstance where people, they can't express who they are, they can't be themselves, because really what they express outwardly is their allegiance to certain factions or their belief in certain things. It leads to this sense of conversation that's kind of two-part, like you have what they're saying and you have what they really mean. And being inducted into this and introduced to this by a novel like this, I think so much more deeply about not just Ireland, but any of those political situations where there are these factions and there are these loyalties being questioned and there are civil disturbances and disputes. Very glad to have read it, and very glad this won a prize as well. It's a pretty unusual book, so I'm glad that it managed to get the accolades that it deserves. And lastly, possibly my favorite Australian book of all time, Alexis Wright's The Swan Book. This is a science fiction novel about a remote First Nations community that is a kind of dumping ground for military waste and refuse. And so it's this very stark environment of a lake that's filled with destroyed battleships, and the people who live there in tremendously difficult circumstances, and the trauma that's faced by our narrator named Oblivia, who has this, in the prologue, is described as this kind of parasite or disease in her brain. I can't remember how they say it. Upstairs in my brain, there lives this kind of cut snake virus in its dollhouse. Little stars shining over the moonscape garden twinkle endlessly in a crisp sky. The crazy virus just sits there on the couch and keeps a good old qui vive out the window for intruders. It's about this character who thinks differently and experiences memory differently, and she's taken out of this environment after a very traumatic event by an Aboriginal man who's being primed to be the First Nations Prime Minister of Australia. And so it's about these two different diverging views of what it means to be Aboriginal and First Nations in Australia, what it means to be tied to a community and the disadvantage and trauma they might face, and what it means to be a performed First Nations individual and to earn a sense of political, not necessarily privilege, but a place in the political society by having that title. And the stark difference that exists there, and the sadness that arises too. Like, I'm very far removed from First Nations issues, but I do feel like I need to know about them and empathize with them, because I live in Australia, I live on First Nations land, and so I need to be empathetic about that. This is a book that made me empathetic about that. By the end of it, I felt such strong anguish because of just how sad this whole circumstance is. And I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't expecting the book, through using its science fiction premise and using its characters, to affect me in that way, but it really, really does. And so, The Swan Book, a pretty difficult read, probably one of the most unusual science fiction books I've read, but just so well done, and something that I could just talk for days about. Like, it's just such an intricate, such a well-constructed story. This is actually my second copy, because whenever I see a copy of this in a bookstore, I buy it so I can give it to somebody. But it's that good. It's really, really good. And lastly, my reflections on reading 100 books per year. So the first time I read 100 books per year was in 2022, and the way I'd succeeded is by doing book a day in February. And I've just continued that for the last 3 years, and this year will be my 4th year of doing it. I don't really feel proud of doing 100 books a year. Like, it doesn't change who I am or how I feel about myself. Like, it doesn't make me a better person or anything. It just means I've read more books. I like being able to talk about books, though, and I like being able to talk about ideas that I get from books, knowing more about the world, knowing more about authors, comparing books and talking about prose styles and the use of various techniques. Like, to me, that's something that I can really fixate on. I love how many different styles there are, different genres, different ways of writing. All of that to me is so interesting. And I mean, all of this is stacked up on shelves and everything's all there for me. It's something that I can keep doing, something that I can keep finding interesting. Because I read so fast, and because I'm able to kind of churn through things, I feel like I have an easier time reading this amount than other folks might. It does mean that I enjoy books a bit less than I think someone that reads 50 or 20 books a year might enjoy them, because I'll read everything. I'll go out of my way to pick books that I know that I won't enjoy, and I will just read faster if I feel like they're not a good use of my time. I'll finish everything. I haven't DNF'd a book in a very, very long time. I think more than 4 or 5 years. And if I really don't like it, I'll just talk about it on the channel and pick something very different for the next book. I think what's useful if you want to read 100 books a year, I don't think that speed read techniques are that useful, because I think that if a book is really enjoyable and really worth your time and attention, you should read it at whatever pace is comfortable for you. I just happen to have a pace that's fast, but sometimes even I will like to slow down a bit and really savor things. I think instead what's really useful is, first of all, to have that regularity in your routine, to know that you can read a certain amount every day, or when I do book a day in February, I will set aside an extra hour before I go to bed, or just find time and really prioritize reading. having something that you work towards as well can be good. So, I mean, I make videos, but I also have challenges. I have certain categories that I like to read, and this would probably be my recommendation, is that if you're going to read 100 books a year, don't read those books randomly, but instead think about what aspects of your knowledge and your intelligence you want to improve by the books you want to select. So one of my favorite categories that I've ever done for Aves de Pavo has been actually aquatic, because I really like books about the ocean, about rivers and lakes, about people's relationship with water, and so I read 12 books, one each month, about a different body of water, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the way the different writers would use language to express their feelings about the ocean, different relationships between narrators in the ocean, and I think having those comparisons was what really made things alive for me, being able to see that there are these different choices that authors can make, and here are the choices that I liked, and here are the choices I didn't like so much. Being able to find books that have commonalities and connections is fun. And so I would suggest doing some categories. Find authors that you like and read every book that they've ever written, or follow a thread of authors, follow a particular very niche genre like New Weird or New Sincerity or Regency Romance or something that's just very, very in its own category. Read a few books from that category and think, well, how do I feel about it? Do I like it or dislike it? Do I like the book that is the most emblematic of that genre, or do I like the book that kind of subverts that genre? And I have no real recommendations for this, because once you've arrived at 100 books a year, and I think you arrive at this point not overnight, you arrive at this point having developed a reading habit, going from 20 to 50 to 100, you'll have your own habits, and you'll have your own things that you like. I know people who read 100 books a year that fixate on fantasy, that fixate on horror, that read all the works of Stephen King or read all the works of Brandon Sanderson. That's still a very rich and full and meaningful reading life, and I'm not really judgmental of what we'll choose to read. If reading 100 books a year is what's enjoyable, then I'm very happy for you. And if reading 0 books a year is the most enjoyable, then I'm also very happy for you. I think reading is an enjoyable activity in any form it can be, but I hope that people aren't out there criticizing others for reading too much or reading too little. I think that however much you like to read in any given year is the right amount for you. But hopefully some of these recommendations are useful. Hopefully I get to make more recommendations videos in the future as well. I've kind of exhausted all the books I'd like to recommend, because I recommended 20 books in this video, but yeah, I mean, I'm having a good time. Hopefully I can talk more about things I like more in the future. I can be more positive about my reading experiences and really make this channel something that communicates in a worthwhile way to everybody. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope your reading year this year is very fruitful, no matter how much you choose to read. And yeah, let me know what you've been enjoying so far. Let me know how many books you want to read this year. Yeah, let's keep up to date with challenges, and I will see you next time.